Uh, Greetings to all of you participants in this refresher program. Uh, in this session, I'll be talking to you about not only the status of journalism and mass communication education in India, but also some of the issues and challenges that very often we are confronted with. As all of you know, if we look at the history of journalism and mass communication education in India, it dates back to nearly 100 years ago when Dr. Annie Besant, as part of the Theosophical movement, set up the National University. And one of the subjects that was chosen for education was journalism. Journalism by then had more or less passed through what we call as a acute colonial phase. It had also moved into the formative stages of a nationalist movement, and clearly the field of journalism was divided in terms of its functions and what kind of a role it could perform. There were some who believed that journalism should reflect on what was happening, and there were many who believed that journalism should also promote a cause. If we look at the early efforts of the National University of India, it was rooted in the philosophy that journalism should serve the purpose or serve a purpose. Now, while this phase constitutes an important historical link, we may have to move towards the early 40s when, for example, the Punjab University in the undivided India, under the guidance of Professor P Singh, started the journalism program. Then there have been attempts by many other universities, and by the time of independence, there was some recognition that journalism, at whatever level we want to offer, can be part of a university system of education. Now, the issues in the formative phases of development of journalism education were rooted in what we call as how do we match the expected skills of the industry. And as all of you know, the dominant industry which was potentially capable of employment was the print media. Now, the dilemma started with no doubt the dominance of the English language press in the Indian context and its potential for employment. But we cannot also ignore that there was a significant number of Indian language publications, both dailies as well as periodicals. Now, given the university education system and its own history, the medium of instruction was English. And for some reason, then and to a great extent even now, the medium of instruction dilemma has continued to affect many disciplines in higher education, and more so a field like journalism. The dilemma in journalism and mass communication becomes more acute because journalism and mass communication basically deals with people and their understanding and knowledge. And naturally, the onus is on the comfort level of the people with regard to their language. Now, by any account, if you look at the distribution and dispersion of languages in India, you would notice that there is a range of languages, mother tongue, dialects, etc. And journalism is spread by and large in a few Indian languages and predominantly more in Hindi, and although not very, what should I say, as intensely circulated as the Indian language press, the English press or the English language press in India has a substantial circulation pattern, and in many ways has retained its influential role in formation and circulation of public opinion. Now, there are many schools of thought with regard to a subject like journalism and mass communication. A very significant feeling also exists as to whether this can be taught. I mean, whether journalism can be taught. And there are many who obviously represent the education sector, people like you and me, who have a belief that, like many other subjects, journalism can be taught. And this has been the assumption on which many of the programs in Indian universities have developed. And the challenge has been from the very beginning as to how and where we should look for development of curriculum. Now, what is the difference between education and training is something that we need to ponder. Education has always believed that the overall personality of an individual is something that education should provide, whereas training is niche driven. It's specific, that I need to acquire a skill. Now, university education rooted in a multidisciplinary setup has always believed that it can take advantage of its liberal spread and contribute towards a holistic personality. And this is one of the reasons why many of the old school journalists believe that irrespective of whether they have a degree in journalism or not, what they bring with them is a comprehensive bachelor's or master's degree in different subjects, and they will continue to apply that knowledge with an additional skill, that is writing and communication. Now, where the curriculum has probably failed over a period of time, that's the criticism, is that while the former part, that the liberal education is achieved probably, the skill part is less than expected. Now, here comes another dilemma for university education. How much of a skill component it should lay emphasis on, and how much does it have the required competency in providing the skills. Now, many of the departments wisely and justified over a period of time brought in what we call as a hybrid or a balanced approach. They use the network of their location and their relationship with the local media and brought in what we call as guest faculty to give the much needed practical skills in subjects like editing, photography, report writing, or sometimes even feature writing, etc. And the core subjects, in terms of a grounded understanding, was provided in subjects like history, ethics, laws, and some of them had contemporary issues like current affairs, for example. No student of journalism could go out of the department without having a comprehensive understanding of what was happening around them. In fact, if you look at some of the recent criticism of particularly television journalists, is that many of the television journalists are not rooted in some aspects of political history, so much so they can't identify either the leaders of some of the important political parties, or sometimes they commit grave blunders. So what is required in journalism education was this kind of a balance where you could impart a very broad liberal understanding, and then you could also impart skill. But the challenges begin more in the skills component, because when the formative primary and secondary education doesn't emphasize so much on language proficiency, the university system is also confronted with addressing the question of language proficiency, which obviously is a very important requirement for the media. And this is where education has to be looked at holistically. Now, when the students with a motivation to be in journalism come into the education system, they would already have some kind of university education, higher secondary and the first degree. Now, where they may or may not be an additional screening of their language proficiency, and this is something that needs to be recognized, and whether in the course of 4 semesters this can be addressed or not, has been a major concern for many departments. But departments have also addressed this by what we call as laboratory practice journals, and the periodicity of it may be far less than what it could be. But this is one opportunity that they provide for, let us say, practical training. Now, as the broadcasting industry also became significant, as in addition to the government's own setup of All India Radio and Doordarshan, you also had number of private broadcasting channels coming up. So the scope of employment widened. Earlier, the scope of employment was in the government sector, particularly in what we call as the information and the public relation setup of both the central government and the state government, and in some cases public sector undertakings. The corporate sector was not as significant as it is today, and therefore the pattern of employment was more or less well understood, and universities could add in components. For example, public relations and advertising in many universities was dealt with as one subject. But when advertising developed to a significant extent, developed as in it amplified, many departments separated and offered programs in public relations distinctly and separate from advertising. Now, this pattern had more or less determined the relationship between education and the range of employment opportunities. Even in those in that particular time frame, there was always dialogue, scope for dialogue and discussion between the academicians as well as the media practitioners as to how and where the training and instruction could improve. Now, post-liberalization, when the media and communication ecosystem in India changed, the opportunities for employment increased. Apart from the opportunities for employment, there were also a change which was being brought about through the induction of technology. Technology was being absorbed at a very fast pace, and university departments and journalism departments were naturally expected to keep pace with technology. Now, this brought in requirements of infrastructure and requirements of training to acquire the additional or new skills for the technologies that come in either in print or electronic or some would say digital. What also happened was that, like in the earlier phase, the cost of equipment that was suitable for training, I would say suitable for training and not necessarily completely state of the art, because state of the art is something that requires huge investment, which not only in India but in many other places also training and education is given more in terms of exposing the students with familiarity and also exposure to state of art through visits, etc. But the basic core equipment configuration is not necessarily always state of the art. Now, When broadcasting expanded, new and new and additional subjects had to be factored. So, education institutions went beyond print orientation and incorporated training for broadcast journalism as well. Now, one of the criticisms that has been leveled then and even now it continues is that education programs or journalism programs or training programs are skewed more towards the practice of journalism and not necessarily the other forms of content in the media. This is one of the reasons why the media and entertainment sector has been completely bypassed in our training initiatives. And some would argue that it is a case of missed opportunity for the full scale development of a mass communication department. And now this is where a lot of debates in the recent past, particularly among the senior academic circle, was about the issue of nomenclature. And you would recall that the University Grants Commission, through a government gazette notification, has defined and given instruction as to the names of degrees that university should follow. Whether it is possible or not is a different matter. But in our field, there was always been problems in, I wouldn't say problems actually, it would be more a case of the thought processes of the founding head of the department. Some have continued in the tradition of journalism departments, where as I was saying, the focus is on journalism related to news production, news gathering, and so on and so on. Some have believed that a comprehensive name such as communication is more appropriate, because here we look at communication both as mediated through, let us say, a mass media, and we also look at communication that has existed before even mass media came about. So there communication is a social process. So there have been departments which have been named as departments of communication, encompassing journalism, mass media, and social. And there are departments which are called only mass communication, and their approach is that we deal with mass communication as it is practiced and prevalent in mass media like radio, television, and so on. Whatever it is, whether we should continue to engage with the dilemma of nomenclature I'm not very sure. I don't believe that we should be contesting and fighting over the nomenclature as much as what is it that a comprehensive program in our departments can offer and is offering. I think it's important that all of us build on the skills that we have, the access to infrastructure that we have, and the sensitivity of the region where we work. I think the future of programs in communication or journalism increasingly lies in sensitivity to particular and peculiar needs of the region. And this is also one of the reasons why uniform model curricula may not work in a pluralistic and diversified country like India. For example, as early as 1981, the UGC, in fact still it has on its website what we call as a model curriculum. The good part of that curriculum is that it has tried to gather elements from as many departments as possible. That's a good part. I mean, if you actually look at the document, it gives a fairly good indication of what are the different, range of subjects, etc., that you can offer. The limitation, if any, is that it cannot be implemented as a template in different institutions. So that is one of the reasons why a prescribed curriculum does not necessarily work, because particularly in the university system, you have a positive tradition and legacy of curriculum development, which is tied to autonomy of a university, etc., etc. And therefore, programs like ours also have certain flexibility. A flexibility in, for example, the basket of courses that you can offer. Suppose you have a very strong foreign languages component in your university. No harm in allowing that department to offer few foreign language programs, which can be a value add to the students. Let us say you have a very strong economics department or a commerce department. Students can as well pick up fundamentals of these subjects, because media content is not necessarily always about politics, which many a time is an obsession, not only in the media but among the people. But today you see that, for example, more and more emphasis is being laid on commerce, trade, health. So the scope of engagement of our efforts is wide and varied, and also challenging. Now, because for some reason we did not anticipate or plan, or were receptive enough to recognize the changes, somewhere the gap between our training initiatives and the requirements beyond journalism per se widen. and increasingly we started feeling, what should I say, deficient in catering to the potential employment versus the limited employment that is taking place in the journalism sector. A parallel development which has challenged us further is the proliferation of what we call as the media-backed schools. I mean, it's common knowledge that some of the media-backed schools are doing very well, and their diploma holders are placed quite well, I should say, in leading media enterprises. Now, what is it that they offer that makes our programs, I would say, less competitive? Is the difference lies in the public character of our institution versus the selection and the profile of the students. Now, when I say public character, our institutions have to engage in a much larger and a broader constituency. We are guided by certain principles, justified principles of public education. And this is a challenge. As I said earlier too, today technology, no doubt, is very important, but technology is demystified in the sense that both production and consumption technologies, for example, mobile phones, etc., have enabled the production and distribution of content more instantly and also well within the hands of the students. So, when we talk about mobile journalism, when we talk about social media handles, I think these are some of the immediate and visible products and gadgets that have to be factored in our training efforts. Of course, it has to be integrated in a certain degree of, what should I say, appropriate hardware and software mechanisms which renders the content, in a far more, what should I say, attractive manner, because obviously handheld devices may not meet the expected standards of a large scale viewing, particularly on your mobile screens, etc. So, rather than feeling that we are unable to face this constant stream of challenges, I particularly feel that given the profile of many of you youngsters who have come into the digital communication age more comfortably than people like us. Absorption and adaptation and integration. For example, I don't see any reason why reading, which many a time has been pointed out as the greatest deficiency among the youth, positively reading has to be encouraged, and today reading can be encouraged because they are available in multiple formats. So, a recognition that the society has changed, society has other opportunities, probably will help us to meet the challenges. One or two other points that I wish to stress is that what differentiates an industry practice from what is required in an education institution is an industry, for whatever reason it justifies, can say that it is changing with the times. But I think education institutions have a larger role, because society is guided by a set of values, principles. That is why emphasis on ethics, on certain values have to be inculcated. I use the word have to be inculcated because if it is not done in the period of their association with the institution, they may not have opportunities even to reflect on what those basic values are. So, I would emphasize that more than obsession with what the syllabus is, if we can work together on certain aspects of where and how skills can be imparted, where and how encouragement can be given for language proficiency, and where and how contending with technology. Today, contending with technology is a very important aspect. How can you, for example, look at society at large where communication has moved from the old notion of mass communication where except newspaper, other media were all in the realm of viewing or listening across, let us say, different sections of the different components of the family. Today the situation is that the spread of media, media as in personal media like mobile phones, etc., have virtually become convergent platforms of all kinds of content that you can receive and also upload. Now, this has slightly altered the relationship between the content producer and the consumer. Old practices of journalism believed that they had a mechanism by which whatever needs to be communicated goes through a process of verification, validation, concerns for objectivity, and the familiar notions of social responsibility towards the society, etc., etc., were all factored in established practices of journalism and journalism institutions. Today, the situation has changed in the sense that many of the media have also moved to social media platforms. That's one which we may have to discuss at length in the context of new media. But what is also important here is that theoretically, every consumer also can be a producer of content. People tend to use the term prosumer, for example. In between, we had practices of citizen journalism, for example, that why not a citizen himself or herself take up causes and upload issues of concern in their locality or region or what is important to them. So, the distinction also has come, which was there earlier too. Earlier, particularly schools which had a interest in media education wanted to look at educating the public on how to read and understand media. So, media education in that sense was rooted in certain values and principles. Now, in today's context, it is also equally important that maybe the students are made sensitive that more than everybody being able to produce and upload content, what is important here is a sense of responsibility. And it is this sense of responsibility that makes schools of communication more important than widely distributed content of all kinds and all hues. And this is where I think we would have a greater responsibility to be able to educate. For example, schools can launch weekend classes for the community, how to detect, how to understand fake news, what should be the restraining aspects of rumor mongering, because we live in a very volatile situation of various kinds of divisions, various kinds of problems, all of which we know, but what we do not know is that with a little bit of education and sensitivity, the unintended abuse of social media in one's hand can be reduced, diminished, and who knows, in the long run, social media can be a more responsible tool of communication than what it is today. Thank you.